guia de estilo e instruções para síntese de fala. Você é um narrador palestrante com voz potente, forte e autoritária. Este é o início da mensagem. Comece com energia total e um tom de comando, capturando a atenção imediatamente. The hedgerow did not look like a place for a machine to be reborn. It was a living wall of earth and roots and thorn that had stood for generations. An architecture of field and fence that kept livestock where they were supposed to be and kept the roadways to the villages narrow and slow. It kept sound low. It kept sight lower still. On this wrong side of a lane in the bocage, under a sky diced with high, thin cloud, a hybrid sat like a misplaced animal. A hull that had once been French, a turret welded from German steel, tracks misfitted and mud-caked. The shape betrayed its lineage. The graceful curve of an old chassis half hidden beneath a new superstructure. It breathed diesel. It smelled of oil and wet leather and the thin metallic tang of paint heated by the sun. Alfred Becker walked the lane with a field map folded in his gloved hand and a cigarette stub tucked against his lip. He did not look like a man given to theatrics. His coat was functional, his cap low, his expression a concentration on small facts, the angle of a plate, the warp in a road wheel, the way a return roller had been lashed with wire. He moved as if the world were a mechanism, and every object would answer if only one knew where to prod. He had been called, most properly, an engineer. What that meant in practice under the sky of occupied France was a tangle of improvisation and compromise. When Becker reached the tank, he paused, placed a hand on the cold steel as if to check its pulse. The men around him, a corporal who kept time with his jaw, a French machinist with oil black under his nails, a young driver whose jacket smelled faintly of lavender from home, fell silent. Becker did not speak. He looked and walked the hull as a surgeon inspects a patient. Where others saw a crude machine sewn from what the war had left behind, Becker read designs. Suspension stressed here, a reinforcement needed there, a breach of design whose remedy would not be elegant but would be sufficient. The hybrids were not born of grand plans. They were answers to questions that the German front staff had posed with increasing urgency after 1940. How to make more guns faster. How to convert what lay in captured depots into something that could be sent to the field and turn the tide in a local fight. The answers were not glorious. They were practical, often ugly, and always hurried. Becker's gift, if one could call it that without tasting the word gift with unease, was the ability to see the potential in what had been declared useless. He could see that a Somua S-35, once the pride of French cavalry, could carry a formidable gun if its turret were removed and a box welded in its place. He could see that Lorraine tractors would accept an open-topped superstructure carrying an anti-tank gun. He could see where a Hotchkiss hull could be reorganized into a carrier. He saw a puzzle in scrap, and he solved puzzles. But the workshop was not a laboratory. It was an occupied space with levers of coercion pressing against it. The men who bent over axles and cut plate were not volunteers in a cheerful guild. Many were French machinists, requisitioned by decree, brought from towns and villages because German demands outweighed local will. Some worked because they had to, family rations, a roof, the knowledge that resistance might cost them their lives. Others worked because survival had forced them into collaboration of a kind that left no simple moral map. There were small resists and invisible refusals. A bolt left loose where it could be detected and corrected before use. A file that failed on purpose to ruin a gear. A scrap of metal's exact measurement fudged so that a part would not sit properly. Becker knew and had learned to live with the economy of these compromises. He had also learned to rely upon the stubborn competence of those hands, though he would never name their price. He arrived at the conversions with an engineer's impatience toward the ceremonial. He recorded details in a slim notebook more than he spoke. His notes were terse. Lorraine, number 12, transmission okay, weld at rear weak, refit patron wheel. When he allowed speech, it was to the mechanics in short directives, and to his subordinates in sentences that cut to the bone. He expected function, and in function he found his meaning. The reckoning for him was the machine and its performance. Becker's command was, in organizational terms, an anomaly. It was a field conversion detachment cobbled into the Army's ordnance network, attached to frontline divisions as a source of late, improvised strength. It began with a practical restlessness. The German army moving across Europe had inherited, by victory and capture, a panoply of foreign vehicles. To supply the front with standard panzers required time and foundries and resources, increasingly scarce under Allied blockade and bombing. Converting what was at hand required fewer resources and could be done close to the front, provided one had the men, the skill, and the men's quiet endurance. The men around Becker were a mixed corps. German NCOs insisted upon order. They measured time with watches and counted necessity in terms of supplies. French journeymen arrived with trained hands, but with an air of private exhaustion. There were Polish and Ukrainian laborers pressed into service from transit camps, a workforce extracted from the continent's torn human landscape. Their conversations were sparse. Laughter, where it occurred, was thin and often brittle. When the air raid alarm screamed, they moved as if by habit. Drop the wrench, take cover beneath steel, count breaths until the sky's anger passed. Becker's conversions bore names and numbers. Hotchkiss H-39 hulls reborn as carriers. Samoa S-35s transformed into fixed gun platforms. Lorraine 37L tractors framed to carry anti-tank guns atop a welded box. To the Allied intelligence and to the soldiers who met them in hedgerow ambushes, these contraptions carried a nickname that suggested both astonishment and disdain: Frankenstein tanks. The image fit because the machines looked pieced together, because their profiles were unfamiliar, because they carried the memory of their original makers into a service that inverted their intent. Becker, when he was not thinking in steel, found the term ugly and inaccurate. The machines were not monsters, but instruments. But he understood the metaphor's force. He was creating utility from ruin. He had no power to make the ruin anything but what it was. In the months leading to June 1944, the workshop's tempo ratcheted upward. The Allies were close, and the German command's need for mobile anti-tank and close support units increased. Becker's men worked through nights lit by acetylene flames and by the faint green of jars of lantern oil. The rhythm was rhythm of necessity. Bolt, measure, fit, weld, test. The smell of grease and heated metal became the everyday liturgy of the yard. Men's hands grew rougher, their voices lower. The yard's calendar was not measured in dates as much as in orders and in the arrival and departure of convoys. Each finished vehicle was a promise and a risk. Each failure a danger both to the crew and to the men who had made it. There were occasions when Becker, meticulous, private, allowed an audible emotion. Once, upon examining a delivered carrier whose welds had been hurried beyond saving, he ran a hand over the jagged seams as if touching a wound in another man. "Not enough time," he said, and the words were not complaint but fact. He had learned to accept the world's lack of time. He had not learned to enjoy it. The conversions found their operational field in the bocage, those green living walls that transformed Normandy into a chessboard of ambush and counter-ambush. There, narrow lanes became funnels. The hedgerows provided concealment. They also choked movement. A conventional armored column could not reveal itself without losing men. Becker's hybrids, with lower profiles and unorthodox shapes, could position themselves in the folds between fields and road, could emerge, fire, and vanish behind living earth. In some sectors, they offered a tactical surprise that bought hours or saved a flank. In others, they were stationary targets, stranded by mechanical failure or by the very ingenuity that had birthed them. Field reports from British and Canadian units that faced these hybrids were dispassionate. The machines were odd, they posed problems to any standard doctrine, they were harder to recognize at a glance. For the men in the field, the important thing was not the provenance of the hull, but the shape of the threat. For Becker, the important thing remained whether the machine did its job. Success for him was measured in yards held that would otherwise have been lost, in guns silenced, in men saved, and men lost. He kept these measures close and private, as if counting bodies were a necessary ledger he would rather not show. The moral arithmetic of Becker's work was not a calculus he enjoyed. During rare evenings when the workshop dimmed and the men drifted to their bunks or to cigarettes behind a wall, he sat over a small map and wrote. The map bore his neat handwriting, circles and arrows, margins of steel that indicated probable sectors of deployment. Once he wrote a line that could have been a private question. How much of service is service to a thing, and how much to the thing behind it? He did not send the note anywhere. He kept it folded in the back of his book. The question was neither answered nor resolved. Sabotage was a long shadow at the yard. The French machinists brought to the work a repertoire of small resistances. A bushing measured an extra hair too tight. A rivet set a half a millimeter too shallow. None of these were overt acts. Each was a margin that might produce failure at a time when failure could mean death. Becker learned to inspect with suspicion and to test every assembly under load. When a part failed, he would look to the man who had worked it and then look away. There was a subtle economy of gestures, a tightening of a jaw, a cigarette handed across in silence, a meal shared in the yard. The machines were built in the presence of compulsion, and compulsion bent human behavior in ways that no engineering could wholly correct. The week of the invasion was a compression of prior fears. In the early hours of June 6, 1944, Allied assault landed on beaches along the Norman coast in a storm of steel and water. Reports filtered through to the yards in fragments. Heard radios, rumors, maps quickly reannotated, until the pace of orders became frantic. Becker spent the first day in a state of focused motion. Vehicles were dispatched with hasty crews. Driver training became a crash course in dead reckoning. The hybrids were committed where they could be, not where Becker might have chosen. They took positions along lanes and in farmyards, behind hedgerows primed for ambush. The men who drove them were given maps with hastily scribbled routes and a handful of instructions: hold, withdraw, delay. Air power stitched the skies into a new geometry. Allied aircraft, from low-flying fighter bombers to heavy formations sweeping overhead, made movement deadly. Where a hybrid might have been concealed by a bank or a tree line, the sky was an ever-changing lens. Becker watched as vehicles he had helped refit were turned into smoldering husks by strafing runs and precise dives. He had expected losses. He had not expected the speed at which the front, once measured in days of maneuver, would become a procession of lightning strikes and sudden, irreversible breaks. Battle is auditory as much as visual. In the hedgerow, it comes as a change in the sound of air, the crump of artillery, the thin stutter of machine gun fire, the far, dull bass of larger guns. In one engagement outside a village thick with overgrown hedges, a converted somua, its boxy superstructure newly buttressed, took position at the road's elbow. The crew were young men who had names that Becker only sometimes learned. They smelled of sweat and cold coffee. They handled their weapons with careful, necessary attention. When the Allied infantry came down the lane, the machine roared, fired. The recoil rocked the family of hedgerows. For a brief hour, the machine's presence made a difference. It halted an advance until the attackers changed their axis. Then the sky came. An aircraft, small and silver, slid low and unleashed a ribbon of fire. The somua shuddered. Smoke bled from a seam. Becker, who had been observing from behind a tree, ran forward with a handful of mechanics. They fought the flames as if fighting a narrow death by hand. They pushed bodies and tools and water and oil. In the end, the vehicle burned with a concentrated hot color that left metal warped into textures like the inside of a shell. The crew escaped with burns and fear, and a sort of blankness that follows near miss. Becker stood with his hands blackened by oil and looked at the ruin. He felt a strange double ache, loss of function and the recognition of what that loss would mean for others. Operation Charnwood in early July tightened the vise further. Allied forces moved methodically toward Caen, pressing with infantry and armor, leveraging air and artillery in tandem. Becker's units were called upon to hold flanks, to buy time for retreats, to establish positions that might delay the enemy. Each assignment was a bet against exhaustion and against the growing scarcity of materials. Fuel began to be rationed in ways it had not been before. Axles that failed were cannibalized from other already dead hulls. The yard's store of useful scrap diminished like a currency that was spent. In the field, the improvised armor found its limits. Where it could be concealed and used in short, decisive engagements, it performed well enough. Where it had to stand and trade fire with better armored, purpose-built tanks, it suffered. The German formations themselves were increasingly aware of the strategic mismatch. They had local tactical successes, but were outpaced and out-resourced on the larger map. Becker began to understand his work not as a means to victory, but as an act of tactical triage. He felt the irony keenly. The skill that produced these machines was being used to manage decline. Becker's relationship with his superiors was complex. Some officers admired his results and described them in clipped reports with the faint admiration of men trained to admire effectiveness. Rommel's name circulated like a judgment in the higher staff. An endorsement when it came, a practical note on the need for mobile anti-tank defense. It was said that Rommel appreciated resourcefulness.
that in the campaigns of Western Europe he favored any measure that could complicate Allied plans. Becker did not court praise. When called before higher officers, he explained, in technical terms, the capabilities and limits of his creations. He recorded metrics and failure points. He never offered grander claims than the facts could bear. For all the professional focus, the human cost threaded through Becker's life like a shadow. The yard contained families who had been drawn into the work by a mandate, by fear, by the sheer arithmetic of survival. Their stories surfaced in small moments. A son who could not be sent to the front because his father's metal work gave the household bread. A woman who mended uniforms and then secretly stitched the names of missing men into the hems. A young French machinist who asked for enough material to fix his sister's plow and then disappeared one night, later rumored to have fled to the Maquis. Becker observed these things without grand gesture. He paid a daily price of conscience and kept it like a ledger, private and unsent. By late summer, attrition had taken a toll. Vehicles that lingered in fields after engagements became markers of a different kind. The burned-out hulks were monuments to improvisation's limit. When the front moved, the convoys took what they could. Where machines were immobile, they were stripped. Metals were separated, radios pried from dashboards, cupolas torn from turrets and stacked like the bones of something older. The sight of a half-buried hull, its paint peeled by weather and flame, echoed like a phrase the man could not unlearn. He walked through fields sometimes and counted the carcasses as if they were lines on a page, each one a sentence about human decisions. The retreat eastward in the autumn and winter of 1944 was a slow erosion. Becker and his men abandoned some workshops entirely, taking crucial jigs and tools and leaving behind what could not be moved quickly. Other sites were destroyed by Allied bombardment that did not distinguish between frontline depots and repair yards. Supply lines fractured. Replacement parts vanished into the general scarcity. The ingenuity that had once seemed to promise a certain narrow exception to the Army's material needs now confronted the greater arithmetic of defeat. Capture came, finally, not as an exclamation, but as a series of small, inevitable steps. In the spring of 1945, movements grew sporadic, then stopped. Orders ceased to arrive with the confidence of earlier times. Becker and a handful of men moved east with the last trains and convoys. Allied columns, advancing across the map of Europe, overtook positions formerly deemed secure. Becker's detachment surrendered in a field town shut down by artillery and confusion. The capture was formal, quick, efficient. Men were counted and processed. Weapons were collected. Becker handed in his papers and his notebook. He did not perform the dramatics of confession or defense. He had thought often, privately, about how his work would be read, and now the reading would be done by men with clipboards and by a world eager for clean narratives. Interrogation followed the procedures of occupation and inquiry. Becker answered questions about assembly and supply with the same economy he had always used. He described, in technical but not revelatory terms, the capabilities of his creations. He refused to indulge in broad political statements. He denied, with quiet precision, any personal enthusiasm for the regime's ideology. No one asked him to recite manifestos. The questions were smaller and more consequential. Who supplied the raw materials? Who provided the labor? Who ordered certain deployments? He admitted to his role without rhetorical flourish. The investigators were clinical, their interest a mix of intelligence gathering and historical accounting. Becker's hands, stained for years with oil, were washed clean for photographs. The photographs flattened nuance. Post-war life for many of those who had lived inside the machinery of occupation was a slow unmaking. Becker returned to engineering in quieter domains. There was no parade of praise, no state honors. If anything, the man retreated into the profession's practicalities. Contracts with small firms, consulting that focused on logistics in peacetime industries, careful, small jobs that kept his hands occupied and avoided political theater. He wrote no book. He gave no interviews that sought to convert technical tableaus into ideological arguments. He seemed to prefer being remembered as a man who did what he could in a world that had demanded action and in which choice had been narrowed to few clean options. The legacy of Becker's work, however, resisted any tidy conclusion. For military historians and engineers who surveyed the ruins and examined reports, these field conversions offered lessons about adaptation under resource constraints. They showed how a practice born of scarcity could influence doctrine on field repair and the salvage policy for captured material. After the war, armies studied makeshift solutions, not to praise their makers, but to understand how material improvisation could extend operational capabilities in emergencies. Becker's name appeared in technical appendices and in reports that treated his contributions as case studies, neither exalted nor condemned, but used as empirical data. In museum hangars years later, a restored Lorraine tractor bearing an angled superstructure would sit under glass with placards that described its origins in neutral language. Visitors read the details and moved on. Local farmers would point to a blackened dent and tell the story of the day the sky erupted, the day men from far away fought in their lanes. For some, the hull was a scar on the land. For others, it was a relic of a moment when normal life had been repurposed by a war machine. In city museums, the vehicles were framed as artifacts of technological adaptation. Visitors lingered and read captions. Children asked blunt questions. Adults shuffled with the knowledge of decisions made under duress. The objects resisted simple meaning. Becker himself, in private, kept no illusions about the clarity of judgment that would be applied to his life. He had, reluctantly, played a role in a war machine that had killed and taken and reshaped entire societies. The hands that repaired transmissions had also been part of a system that facilitated campaigns. He knew the phrase that historians would use: complicity. He also knew the phrase that engineers used: responsibility to function. The two phrases had collided in him for years. He did not seek absolution. He sought, in a manner perhaps typical of men of his craft, a reasoned accounting and then a way to live afterward, quietly, within the commitments of the everyday. In the years after the shooting stopped, he would sometimes visit a scrapyard where hulks of hybrid machines lay beneath ivy. He would touch the cold steel and trace with a fingertip the outline of a weld he had once approved. There was a steadiness to these visits, an attempt to translate motion into memory. At times, he would stand and watch a child climb over a rusting hull, laughing, while the parents watched with the unmarked look of those who have seen too much to react with drama. Becker read those watches like one reads a machine's gauges. They told him that life continued in other forms. Historical voices rendered Becker in varying shades: an able mechanic, an improviser of value, a cog in a criminal system, a man who had, with his tools, made the war run a little longer in certain lanes of France. None of these voices captured the whole. He had been neither saint nor simple villain. He had been a practitioner of a craft whose uses were determined by political and military decisions in which his own agency had been both present and limited. The machines he built were evidence of a mind that could salvage, of hands that could mend, and of the forced labor and human cost that accompanied such labor in occupied places. In the end, the machines themselves seemed to answer the question Becker had once written quietly in the margin of his notebook. They were both ingenuity and ruin. They bore the imprint of thinking and craft, and they bore the unmistakable marks of a system that used human skill toward ends that were, in large measure, destructive. Standing before a restored hull in a dim museum light, one could admire the engineering without forgetting the context of its making. The last recorded photograph of a hybrid machine in a Normandy field shows late afternoon light slanting across the hull, the metal catching the sun like a relic. Beyond it, the hedgerows recede. The land, persistent as ever, continues to hold its lanes, and its lanes their stories. The machine is gone now, its elements dispersed into scrap, into museums, into the soil. What remains is the memory of hands, calloused, commissioned, desperate, moving in the small economies of survival and efficiency. Becker's life, like the metal he touched, is folded into that memory, part testament to human skill, part evidence of a world that demanded sacrifice and ordered it with political will. He had taught generations of technicians lessons that would outlast the particular cause to which he had applied them. How to make the best of what was at hand, how to test under stress, how to salvage with an eye for usefulness. Those lessons, disembedded from the war, entered peacetime industries and field repair doctrines. They were practical, translatable. Yet no technical manual could easily capture the moral weather in which such practices had been forged. In the end, a rested hull under a shroud of ivy and a neat museum display both said the same thing. The world can be rebuilt from its own ruins, but the reconstruction carries the fingerprints of what came before. Becker's name appears in technical footnotes and in museum labels, sometimes rendered with a historian's detached voice. Those who study him find in his life an emblem of the tangled line between craft and coercion. He did not seek to be emblematic. He sought to be useful and competent in the terms of his craft. History, however, assigns its categories as it will. The hedgerow where the first hybrid had crouched that summer of 1944 has grown and been trimmed and grown again. The lane that once funneled soldiers now ferries tractors and bicycles. A farmhouse on the bend has been painted and repainted. Men and women pass, and the war's noises have receded to a different frequency. The occasional historian's visit, the slow reclamation of fields. On a calm day, one can hear something like the echo of metal settling back into the earth, a faint sound beneath the birds. It is not a moral verdict. It is simply the sound of things returning to a different purpose, the slow work of seasons rewriting the language of a place. Alfred Becker's machines remain as traces, technical footnotes in the annals of field engineering, and stubborn, ambiguous artifacts of a time when ingenuity and terrible necessity were tangled together. They teach a lesson not of heroism but of care, that when skill serves power, even the most conscientious hands must reckon with the consequences. The machines were impressive. They were also instruments in a larger system that had demanded suffering and taken lives. The finale imagen que enduras is not an instruction manual nor a monument to genius, but a rustic hull beneath museum glass, its surface marked by welds and weather, a small, cold memorial to what was made and to what the making cost. Becker lived long enough to see the metal he had tended become text and then relic. He survived the immediate denouement, captivity, the questions that were not always gentle, the slow bureaucratic sifting that separated those who had given orders from those who had followed them. He returned, as many did, to a smaller world than the one he had left. A house with a patch of garden, a garage with a scattering of tools, a town that remembered the war in the arrangement of its memorials, and in the faces of those who had been young then and were now older in a way that a photograph cannot show. There was no public confession, no dramatic renunciation. Becker's explanations were modest, practical, in the manner one learns at a workbench. Constraints, supplies, an aim to make something that could be repaired in the field, that could be kept running by men with little training and fewer resources. He spoke not of grand politics, but of bolts and bracketry, of tests run at odd hours under acetate light, of the smell of borrowed gasoline. Those who came to record history liked this. It sounded humbler than the rhetoric that had sent men to war, and yet its humility carried its own pressure. It implied decisions made in the narrow terms of cause and effect. It required in the listener a recognition that skill is not innocence. His neighbors saw him differently. To some, he was the man who had fixed their tractors after the requisitions and the shortages. To others, he was a name on a plaque in a book. He attended, when he could, the small veterans' gatherings in the town hall, where talk folded around pipes and coffee cups. There, the language of experience was less concerned with culpability than with survival. What held under strain, what failed, which makeshift solutions had proven serviceable. There was comfort in that. There was also the way practical talk could obscure what practical knowledge had enabled. Becker taught, not in flashy academies or in the pages of celebrated journals, but in the low light of a garage apprenticeship, to boys who wanted to learn how to make a welded seam that would not give under stress, how to improvise a spare when the proper casting could not be ordered, how to read the fatigue in a plate by the faintest of hairline strains. He taught them the cadence of repair: check, remove, replace, test. He could not teach them the moral equation that would follow skill into politics, but he could give them a craft that, in peaceful hands, softened into something ordinary and useful. Occasionally, someone with a different voice entered that orbit. A curator from a national museum, a graduate student studying improvised ordnance, an old enemy whose accent still carried the war's edge. They came with notebooks and a kind of hunger, the hunger to place things in a ledger, to explain, to name. Becker answered questions without theatricality. He showed photographs, drew rudimentary schematics in the dust of a bench, lifted a sample weld for inspection. He watched, sometimes, as younger scholars clothed his pragmatic notes in polemic. He neither corrected them nor offered assent. He understood that what he had made would be taken into arguments he never intended to fuel. There were mornings when he strolled the hedgerow lanes, now quiet, where once the iron clattered. He would find a piece of metal half buried and recognize the grain of a plate, the angle of a rivet. He kept these scraps, small relics of a life that had been practical and terrible. In the winter they sat on a shelf in his workshop, like the fossilized remains of a season. He would touch them as if remembering a colleague. The moral weather did not clear with time. It only layered. Debates in academic journals, heated columns, satellite documentaries that used his name, sometimes without permission. These oscillations affected the small domestic life that remained to him. Letters arrived. A son of a man who had died serving in a unit that had been at the receiving end of a Becker-converted vehicle. A former subordinate who had emigrated and written of gratitude for the guidance that had kept men alive. A museum director requesting access to a surviving hall. Becker read them in the evenings under a lamp. He burned neither the letters that accused nor the ones that thanked. He kept them in a wooden box along with his old drafting tools. One afternoon, a woman came whose hair was as white as the pages of the patents he had once studied. She introduced herself as Marie Girard, a farmer's daughter from a lane beyond the hedgerows. She spoke with a quiet precision that suggested she had catalogued the past into compartments and found them not wholly satisfying. She had, in younger years, nursed a man who had been wounded in the scuffle that accompanied the arrival of one of Becker's machines. Her father had cursed the German presence, and then, in a softer moment, admitted that a particular modification, an adapted generator, had later been useful in powering a mill he had managed to keep. She carried both bitterness and pragmatic appreciation, as many did. "I have come," she said, "because my grandson studies these things and asks hard questions. He wants to know what a man like you thought when he filed a rivet. Was he thinking of the war? Of the men? Of his pay?" Becker looked at her without surprise. He answered simply, "I thought of the job, of what would break next." The reply was not deflection, but the directness of someone who had lived by the infinitesimal priorities of repair. It satisfied nobody fully. It was the sort of answer a craftsman offers, a truth of limits rather than absolution. Marie listened, Sua's hands folded, and then, as if in conclusion, said, "We have to tell our children that things are made by hands. We must teach them both the how and the why." In the museums, it was not always easy to balance how and why. There were curators who insisted on narrating the machines within a broader tableau. The industrial culture that fed war, the ideologies that gilded them, the human cost. There were technicians who argued for a dispassionate catalog. Here is engineering ingenuity. Here is mechanical adaptation. A photo of Becker's hybrid in situ might be captioned differently depending on which department oversaw the exhibit. Sometimes an explanatory placard would be revised after public rows. The exhibit label that had once read "Field-Engineered Self-Propelled Gun" might be expanded to include "Employed in operations causing civilian displacement," or trimmed back to "Improvised engineering solution." This was not simple revisionism, it was the civic argument over memory. Young historians wrote dissertations on the subject, and those dissertations performed an economy of their own, an exchange between empathy and condemnation. In archives, they found Becker's technical notes. In oral histories, they found fragments of laughter and fear. One doctoral candidate argued that Becker's work represented a technological substratum to the war machine. Not merely the tools, but the knowledge culture that allowed adaptation on the ground. Another insisted that such framing risked sanitizing complicity. They debated at conferences under lights that made coffee look thin and arguments shine sharper than they deserved. It mattered little to Becker whether scholars reconciled his life into one category or another. He spent his days turning wrenches and his nights reading the local paper, where a critic might praise the clarity of a museum label or condemn it. When asked in interviews, rare and always with reluctance, whether he regretted anything, he would consider. Regret was too large a vessel for what he felt. There were things he could not undo, men he would not raise, decisions he had only participated in. He felt rather a persistent smallness, as if the ledger of effects never matched the narrowness of his intention. This smallness lived near his sternum and flared on certain mornings when the sky had that particular gray that seemed to fold history into present. His apprentices were never content with theory. They wanted demonstration. He obliged where he could. Once, surrounded by 3 young men who were learning to bend armor plating for a tractor project, he set down a piece of milled steel and spoke of the choices that had been made. A thicker plate, he said, makes a unit heavier and slower to repair. A thinner plate saves weight but fails sooner. The choice is never pure. It is a balance of available men and metal and the urgency of need. He tapped the metal with the butt of a hammer.
When you make that call, you must think of those who will stand behind it. That is all I can offer you beyond a straight weld. They did not always accept that as sufficient guidance. One of the apprentices, a keen young man with oil-stained fingernails, asked, "But what if the people who stand behind are enemies? Do you still make the call the same way?" Becker looked at him for a long moment. "Skill is a tool," he said finally. "It does not tell you where to aim. That answer you must find elsewhere." This answer, too, traveled into other fields of memory. Veterans on both sides wrote to him, some in gratitude, some in accusation. A letter from a former British driver thanked him for the ingenuity that made repairs possible even in defeat. It ended with an acknowledgement that his gratitude was complicated. Another letter from a family in Normandy asked whether Becker felt sorrow for civilians displaced during operations his machines had supported. He replied with the same economy. Expression of sympathy for suffering, no apology he felt would render what had been done less real. He was not proud, he was not defiant. He existed in a register of working things through, which the rest of the world folded into moral narratives. The museum that finally acquired one of his surviving conversions chose, quite deliberately, to present it behind glass and in an environment that encouraged quiet inspection rather than spectacle. They placed a bench at one side where visitors could sit and read. Names of makers, footnotes, testimonies. Children lingered too, pressing small palms to the glass until a docent gently redirected them. Photographs nearby showed the machine in action and later in decay. One video loop, careful without triumph, showed men hurrying in mud, hands stained, faces set.
The curator insisted on a tone of restraint. He wanted visitors to make the leap from seeing to thinking without a signpost that pointed only to condemnation or to admiration. This, perhaps, was the closest thing to Becker's own sense of legacy, a display that permitted complexity. Visitors left with different impressions. Some left angry, thinking the label did not do enough to account for suffering. Others left quietly impressed by the cleverness of engineering under constraint. A few left unsettled, carrying both responses like two small stones in their pockets. Becker visited the museum once, escorted by a senior curator who treated him with a cautious empathy. He sat on the bench and watched people as they interacted with the metal. He recognized in their faces his own students, his own contemporaries. He felt, oddly, less the weight of accusation than the strangeness of his hands becoming public text. The curator offered him a cup of tea. They spoke of technicalities, the source of a turret ring, the adaptation of a gearbox. Then the curator asked him, in a quiet voice, whether he would like to record an interview for the archive. Becker consented. He sat before a microphone and was asked about the first job that had framed his work. He spoke in the same manner he had always used, direct, unromantic. He spoke of the first day in a fieldworks yard when a commander had outlined a need, and of the hours spent testing a recoil mechanism. At one point, there was a question about responsibility. He paused, then said, "Responsibility is not a single thing. It is a mesh. If you wear one thread more proudly, it may conceal another." He tapped the bench where his palm rested. I was a thread. Afterwards, in the quiet of the car ride home, he considered that phrase, thread, mesh. He had no desire for absolution. He had no belief that a recorded answer could grant it. Yet there was something about putting words to the smallness of his role that eased the tightness he sometimes felt when he woke in the night. That evening, he went back to the garage and laid out his old plans in order, smoothing the brittle edges of paper with slow fingertips. The war had, for others, been a kind of moral crucible that led to dramatic conversions and to steady indignation. For Becker, it had been more like a machine with many parts, each part requiring tinkering. He did not believe his talents absolved the larger design. He did not deny that men in positions of power had used what he and others produced in ways that were cruel. He simply insisted, again and again, that in the direct line from hand to metal to movement, there was a truth of cause and effect that deserved attention on its own terms. Time, finally, made the edges of his life soft. He retired, not with a ceremony, but with a final gathering of apprentices around a workbench as one of them welded a seam and Becker inspected the result, approving in a manner that was almost imperceptible. They gave him a small tool chest, and he kept it beside his bed. When he died, it was not in a blaze of public interest. There was a notice in the local paper, a modest funeral. A few of his former students came. A curator sent a wreath with a simple card. The museum received an envelope containing schematics and a set of annotated notes. In the margin of one page, in Becker's precise hand, was an observation about a weld pattern that reduced stress concentrations. The archivists filed it carefully. After his death, the debates continued. Lectures cited him as an exemplar of the entanglement of craft and coercion. An exhibition devoted to improvised military engineering used his name, but with a fuller context than some earlier displays had managed. A novelist, reading his interviews, wrote a short scene in which a character based on Becker stood alone in a shop and listened to the ring of a hammer. The passage was praised and criticized in equal measure. A historian published a careful biography that mapped the surpits of Becker's influence, tracing the techniques that had leapt from field works into peacetime industry.
It was both laudatory in recognizing competence and stern in insisting on moral awareness. In the village lanes, the rusted hulls that had once crouched in hedgerows became, for the most part, memory. Farmers had long since plowed the lines where troops had once marched. Children rode bicycles along the routes without knowing the weight of metal that had once bent them into temporary architectures of war. Yet sometimes, in the soft afterlight of a summer evening, an old man would stop and say the name Becker aloud, not as praise, not as condemnation, but as a sign that hands had acted and the world had rearranged itself accordingly. What remained, for those who studied the matter with care, was the uneasy lesson that skill, apolitical in its tools, does not exist in a vacuum. It is woven into politics, into orders, into hunger and fear. A welder's seam can be as much an act of preservation as a step along a chain that leads to harm. That complexity did not resolve into tidy categories. It refused to be reconciled to a single tone, whether reverential or accusatory. Yet there was perhaps a quieter duty that emerged from Becker's life and work. The duty to teach the young not only how to join metal, but how to reckon with the possible ends to which their skill might be applied. His apprentices remembered his words about thinking of those behind a plate. The phrase took on different lives in their mouths. Some used it to justify careful, conscientious workmanship in peacetime. Others used it as a prompt to refuse work that felt complicit. It became, in small ways, a moral heuristic, imperfect, contested, necessary. In the end, the machines themselves, when they could be found, were given small shrines. Museums did what museums do best and worst. They froze objects in glass and text, daring visitors to breathe life into what was inert. The machines taught something neither wholly comfortable nor wholly damning: that human imagination and necessity interlock in forms that outlast their makers. The welds that had once been judged by how they held under fire now taught students about stress distribution. The journals that cataloged Becker's techniques taught engineers about resourceful repair. The families of the dead taught the nation about cost. The conversations between them were never neat. History, as an apparatus, continued to assign categories. It preferred judgments. It wrote footnotes and made exhibitions and set plaques. Becker, who had sought only to be useful, ended within those pages as an example for debates that would outlast him. Those debates were not, in the final accounting, about him alone. They were about the human capacity to convert means into ends, and about the moral work that must follow skill into the marketplace of actions. The hedgerow at the lane's bend would be trimmed again and again. Each season, the land would rewrite a language of place. New hands would find old rust and briefly puzzle over it. Year after year, the field would hold its quiet layers of history like the rings of a tree. And buried in archives, on benches, and in the memory of those who had apprenticed under him, the small notes Becker left on paper and metal would continue to be read and reread.
They would provoke contention and reflection, admiration and discomfort. Such is the afterlife of work, not the bright posthumous praise or the sharp condemnation alone, but the slow, stubborn incorporation of a craft into the broader human story. It is a lesson in limits and in accountability, that being adept at shaping things does not exempt one from asking why those things are made, nor from listening when others give an account of the cost. On certain evenings, when the wind in the hedgerows was soft and a light rain began to pattern the lane, one could almost imagine the clumsy outline of a field-engineered hull reappearing for a moment in the mind's eye, its welds glinting, its silhouette awkward but purposeful. The vision was not a summons to mourning, nor to celebration. It was simply an image of hands acted upon the world, and the world, in turn, having been altered. That is the measure Becker left. A trace of craft, a record of consequence, and a reminder that the artifacts of human ingenuity carry with them the histories of the intentions that shaped them.